The following message is by Pastor John Piper. More information from Desiring God is available at www.desiringgod.org.
My topic is the pastor as theologian, reflections on the life and ministry of Jonathan Edwards. Multnomah Press recently reissued a paraphrase, if you can believe it, of Religious Affections. They shouldn't have done it, and I don't recommend the book. I recommend the one that's downstairs that I'll show you in a minute. But they did get a good man to write the introduction for it, Charles Colson. Here's what he writes. The Western Church, much of it drifting, enculturated and infected with cheap grace, desperately needs to hear Jonathan Edwards' challenge. It is my belief that the prayers and work of those who love and obey Christ in our world may yet prevail as they keep the message of such a man as Jonathan Edwards. And I assume you're among the number who love and obey Christ and who long for your prayers to prevail in your churches and in your communities and ultimately in this world, Lord willing, by the year 2000. And I believe that Colson is right, that we very much need not only the message, that was his point, mine is the life and example of Jonathan Edwards as a theologian pastor. Now, most of us do not know Jonathan Edwards. We might know that he was born in 1703 and that he went to Yale and became a pastor in Massachusetts for 23 years and then became a missionary to Indians for the last 7 years or so of his life, and then a few months as president of Princeton before he died at the age of 54. But we don't know this man. We do not know him. We all remember our high school lit classes or our American history classes in ninth grade. I got my son's ninth grade history book the other day and looked up Edwards. He's not in there, period. So I looked up Awakening. There's one paragraph on the Great Awakening in this textbook, and they define it as that heightening of religious fervor that split churches. That was the Great Awakening in my son's textbook. It's a great tragedy. He's at a Christian school, too, so that they might straighten it out in the classroom. Here's what we read if we get an excerpt, namely, sinners in the hands of an angry God. And this paragraph, perhaps. The God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you and is dreadfully provoked. His wrath towards you burns like fire. He looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into the fire. He is of purer eyes than to bear to have you in His sight. You are 10,000 times more abominable in His eyes than the most hateful, venomous serpent is in ours. And so these young 10th graders are given the impression that Edwards was a gloomy, sullen, morose, perhaps pathological misanthrope who fell into grotesque religious speech the way some people fall into obscenity. Never are they asked the question, why did he write like that? What was he trying to do? What would you do in his place if you were trying to exposit Revelation 19:15? The Lord God Almighty will tread the winepress of His wrath with great fury. What language would you find, 10th grader? They don't ask those questions. Nor do we know that he knew his heaven better than he knew his hell, and that his vision of glory is more appealing than his vision of judgment is repulsive. We don't know that he was the greatest thinker that this nation has ever produced. We don't know that most of us don't know that not only was he God's kindling for the Great Awakening, but he was its most penetrating critic. We don't know that Edwards was driven by a great longing to see the missionary task of the church completed, and that his influence on the modern missionary movement is incalculable. Do any of us imagine what an incredible thing it is for this man who was a rural pastor? Northampton was nothing. A rural pastor for 23 years. There were 600 people in the church. It was the only church in the town. A missionary to Indians for 7 years, being asked to leave his church, who reared 11 faithful children, who worked without help of electric light or word processors or quick correspondence or even sufficient paper. Sometimes he would turn the paper sideways, having written on it one way, and write on it the other way, right over the words. He was so short of paper in Stockbridge. Who lived only until he was 54 years old, who had only 300 books in his library when he died. That this man was the greatest, or was involved in producing the greatest spiritual awakening of modern times, wrote theological books that are still being read and ministering to this day, and did more for the modern missionary movement than anyone in his generation. Let me illustrate that last point. He wrote the biography of David Brainerd, a young missionary who died in his house, was in love with his daughter Jerusha. She died of the same disease just a few months later. A very sweet and tragic story. The list of missionaries who testified to the power of Brainerd's life that Edwards took time to write is beyond our knowing. Let me list a few noteworthies. Francis Asbury, Thomas Coke, William Carey, Henry Martin, Robert Morrison, Samuel Mills, Frederick Schwartz, Robert McShane, David Livingston, Andrew Murray. Some of the big names who say that Edwards' work on Brainerd made a difference in their lives. Jim Elliot, we all know, died at the hands of the Alkas. 8 days, I believe, before he died, wrote, "Confession of Pride, suggested by David Brainerd's diary yesterday, must become an hourly thing with me." So for 250 years, Edwards has been fueling the missionary movement with his biography of David Brainerd. But who knows the man who wrote this book? Why he wrote this book? Mark Noel, who teaches history down at Wheaton and loves Edwards, wrote these words about the tragedy of the disappearance of Jonathan Edwards from the scene. He said, "Since Edwards, American evangelicals have not thought about life from the ground up as Christians, because their entire culture has ceased to do so. Edwards' piety continued on in the revivalist tradition. His theology continued on in academic Calvinism, the Princeton School, for example. But there were no successors to his God-entranced worldview or his profoundly theological philosophy. The disappearance of Edwards' perspective in American Christianity has been a tragedy." End quote. And frankly, I wish I could recreate for you, every one of you, what it has meant for me over the years to find my way little by little into the God-entranced worldview of Jonathan Edwards. It began when I was in seminary. I first read, an unlikely place to begin, I think, the essay on the Trinity. And then I read, second, the freedom of the will. I read, third, the dissertation concerning the end for which God created the world. I read, fourth, on a swing in the backyard of my wife's growing up home on a farm in Georgia in 1971, The Nature of True Virtue. And when I was done, I wrote a poem about the woods. And then I read in Germany, The Religious Affections. One of my seminary professors, Lewis Smedes, you may have read some of his ethical works, said to us in a class on ethics, "Find one great and godly giant in the Christian church and make him your lifelong companion." I remember that just as clear as yesterday. And it rung true to me to have a companion of this stature. Edwards has been mine, and it's hard to overestimate what he has meant to me theologically and personally in my vision of God and my love for Christ. Now, this was true